So if you ask, why do we hate Russia? Because Russia stands in the way of us being the unrivaled number one. Now, you could say, well, it's because of all the terrible things that they do. But it's a little more complicated than that. During the Cold War, from 1945 to 1991, we hated Russia because it was communist.
Yes.
Okay, I happen to be quite deeply involved at the end of that period as an economic advisor when they were trying to get out of that horrible system. And I advised President Gorbachev in 1990-91, and I advised President Yeltsin in 1992 and 93. Yeltsin said, we don't want any of this communism anymore. We want to be a normal country. So the United States came up with other reasons to hate Russia. So I watched with my own eyes that the reason that had been given was not the real reason. It was maybe the believed reason, but it was the narrative reason. We hate Russia because it is a godless communist country. Now it is a Russian Orthodox non-communist country, and we still hate Russia. Same deal. And by the way, what's absolutely fascinating is if you go back to 180 years ago, and I'm not kidding, to 1840, our precursor as world hegemon, that was the British Empire, they hated Russia too. And why? For no reason. It was a little before the Bolshevik Revolution, by the way. It was before any ostensible reason, but the British elite hated Russia. Okay, and it shows an interesting answer to your question. A historian named Gleason in 1950 tried to answer the question, how did Britain come to hate Russia? Why is it that by 1840, the British hated the Russians so much that 13 years later, in 1853, the British went to war against Russia, a war of choice, in the Crimean War? So this historian did an amazing job because it was before AI and being able to ask all these good questions. He went through all the archives. He went through all the speeches by British leaders, all the speeches in the House of Commons, all the articles written in the intellectual magazines from 1850 onward. And he posed the question. He said, we were allies of Russia in 1815 in defeating Napoleon.
Yes.
We were allies. Then, just 25 years later, we're enemies. What happened? So he goes through all of the speeches, everything. His conclusion in the end is remarkable. Nothing happened. There was no reason why Britain came to hate Russia, except Russia was big and therefore was an affront to the British Empire. And of course, the British concocted an idea, which was a completely bizarre idea. And that was that the Tsar was going to invade British India through the Khyber Pass. This became known as the Great Game afterwards. This was a crazy idea. The thought never even crossed the minds of these czars. The idea
to march across Afghanistan,
to march across Afghanistan and into India, into the Indian subcontinent to fight the British Empire. It was Looney Tunes. But the British elite came to view Russia as the great threat to the British Empire, the threat to India, the crown jewel of the empire. So much so that by 1840, Britain was rabidly Russophobic. And then by 1853, Lord Palmerston totally concocted a pretext to go to war with Russia, the Crimean War.
Charge of the Light Brigade.
Yeah, Charge of the Light Brigade. And the the Crimean War was a concocted showdown between the British Empire and the Russian Empire. Concocted because the Russians said, we don't want to fight you. They had the Russians had challenged the Ottoman Turks and put some troops in Wallachia at the mouth of the Danube, and because the Ottomans had given some privileges to France that the Russians thought belonged to them. And then the British and the French threatened the Russians, and the Russians retreated. This is the prelude to the Crimean War. The Russians retreated. And then when the Russians retreated, the British said, we now fight on. In other words, the pretext was gone, but they wanted that war. Why did they want the war? They wanted the war because the British idea was to banish Russia from the Black Sea region.
Yeah.
Remember, the Black Sea is Russia's warm water port till today, by the way. It was created as a warm water port in 1783 by the Empress Catherine the Great. And it has been Russia's warm water port since then.
Crimea.
Palmerston in Crimea, in Sevastopol, precisely, which was besieged by the British and the French during the Crimean War. The Russians eventually surrendered, and in the Treaty of Paris in 1856, the Russians agreed to scrap their Black Sea fleet. It remained scrapped for about 20 years, actually. And then, as history always shows, the French went running back to the Russians, ally with us because the Germans are rising in power. And so suddenly the enemy became the friend because you needed a new friend to fight the new enemy, and so on. It's kind of crazy European politics. But the idea of Lord Palmerston was banish Russia from the Black Sea, and you reduce Russia to a third-rate power. Now, all of this is fascinating because, first of all, the Russophobia was a concocted hatred. Second, the war between Britain and France on one side and Russia in 1853 was concocted. But third, we're replaying that almost to the same script today, and almost with exactly the same plot line, which is so weird but true. And why I say that is the United States, quote, or the inside deep state, the CIA and its apparatus and the rest of the military-industrial complex has hated the Soviet Union since 1945, even though they were our ally in defeating Hitler. It turned to preparing for war against our ally within a few months of the end of World War II. This is by itself a very important point. And then from 1945 to 1991, we had the Cold War, ostensibly against communism and against international communism. Then in December 1991, the Soviet Union ended. I don't know if I've mentioned it to you before. I was in the Kremlin that day, literally that hour, sitting in front of Boris Yeltsin, or I was in front of him. And he said to me and to my colleagues, gentlemen, I want to tell you the Soviet Union is over. I heard it probably first in the world, directly from President Yeltsin in December 1990.